I remember when love between us felt effortless, when I could not wait to wake up beside him and share even the smallest details of my day. Back then, everything was bright and hopeful, and I believed our bond was strong enough to withstand anything. Years later, though, I found myself staring across the dinner table at the same man and feeling like we were strangers sharing space. There were no big explosions, no scandal, just a steady fading of laughter and intimacy until what remained was routine and silence. I thought I could live with that, but the emptiness kept growing, and I knew something had to change before I drowned in it. We met young, full of energy and plans, dreaming of building a life together. In the beginning, our days were filled with late-night talks, spontaneous adventures, and tenderness. I had never felt so connected to anyone, and for years I carried the certainty that I had chosen the right partner. Slowly, almost without noticing, our rhythm shifted. The excitement gave way to responsibilities, bills, and the weight of unspoken grievances. I still cared for him deeply, but our closeness turned into something that felt more like duty than desire. I kept telling myself it was normal, that marriage naturally changed with time, yet in the quiet moments I ached for the man who once looked at me like I was the center of his world. It was not one fight or one moment that pushed me to the edge. It was the relentless drip of dissatisfaction. We argued over small things, whose turn it was to cook, the tone of a careless remark, or how distracted he seemed when I tried to talk. The arguments weren't explosive, just wearying, the kind that left both of us retreating into silence. At night, lying next to him, I felt more alone than if I had been sleeping by myself. I tried to bring it up gently, to tell him I missed the warmth we used to share, but he brushed me off with quick assurances or distracted nods. His indifference cut deeper than anger ever could. I began to crave air, space, something beyond the suffocating walls of our routine. I thought maybe if I had a little time away, I could remember who I was outside of being his wife. Maybe I could sort through the confusion in my own head and come back to him with clarity. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the only option left. One night, as we sat in front of the television in silence, I told him I needed some time alone. I tried to frame it gently, explaining that it wasn't about abandoning him but about finding myself again. My words felt clumsy, but they were the most honest I had been in months. His reaction was not what I expected. He didn't argue, didn't demand an explanation, didn't even ask how long I planned to be gone. He just nodded slowly, his face unreadable, and said, "If that's what you need." The simplicity of his response unsettled me. Part of me had braced for resistance, maybe even a fight, something that would prove he still cared enough to hold on. Instead, he gave me nothing but calm acceptance, and it felt like a door quietly closing between us. After that night, I replayed the moment again and again in my mind. I questioned whether he was secretly relieved, whether he had been waiting for me to voice what he already felt. The silence that followed me into the spare bedroom where I decided to stay was heavy. I wanted freedom, but I also wanted to be missed. His lack of visible emotion gnawed at me, making me wonder if I had already lost him long before I asked for space. The days that followed were strange. I went about my routine with an odd sense of detachment, as though I were observing my life rather than living it. I told myself this was temporary, that I only needed time to breathe, but in the quiet moments doubt crept in. I caught myself glancing at him for signs, some flicker of sadness, a question, anything that showed he was affected. But he moved through his days calmly, speaking when necessary, polite but distant, as though I had already stepped out of his life. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. I thought asking for time alone would give me clarity, but instead it revealed just how far we had drifted. What I had imagined as a pause began to feel like a fracture. I wondered if my choice had given him permission to detach completely, or if he had been gone in spirit long before I noticed. Each night, I lay awake in the quiet of my separate room, turning over the same thought again and again. Had I just opened the door for him to walk away forever? The first few mornings of waking up alone felt strange, but liberating. I could linger in bed without worrying about anyone's schedule but mine. I made coffee in silence, opened a journal I hadn't touched in years, and began to pour out thoughts I had kept locked away. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was hearing my own voice again. I spent afternoons reading, walking, even cooking meals just for myself, and there was a relief in the quiet. Yet beneath the surface, guilt simmered. I wondered if I had been selfish, if stepping back from my marriage was an indulgence I couldn't afford. Still, I convinced myself that solitude was necessary, that I needed to rediscover who I was before I could decide what our future should look like. At first, I assumed he was doing the same, reflecting, maybe feeling the ache of separation the way I did. But little by little, I noticed changes I couldn't ignore. He started leaving earlier in the mornings, coming home later at night. His clothes were sharper, ironed with more care, paired with cologne I hadn't smelled on him in years. When I asked casually where he had been, he offered vague answers: work, errands, catching up with a friend. His tone was calm, but something in it felt rehearsed, as though he had practiced just enough to keep me from asking more questions. The phone that once sat on the kitchen counter was now tucked in his pocket, screen angled away whenever it lit up. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, that he had every right to live his life while I asked for space, but unease gnawed at me. One evening, I passed by his laundry and caught a scent I didn't recognize: perfume. Subtle but unmistakable. My chest tightened. I tried to reason it away. Maybe he brushed against someone at work. Maybe it was nothing. But the possibility that he was no longer waiting quietly for me lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. As days stretched into weeks, my emotions twisted. I had asked for freedom, yet the thought of him finding comfort in someone else made me feel sick. I had wanted to step back, not to lose him entirely. Every time I caught sight of his unreadable expression, I felt a pang of jealousy mixed with fear. Did he still see me as his partner, or had I already faded into the background of his life? I found myself studying him in small moments: how he hummed softly as he shaved, how he checked his phone with the hint of a smile, how he seemed more energized than he had in months. Part of me was glad to see life in him again, but another part burned with suspicion that it had nothing to do with me. I began replaying my decision over and over in my mind. Maybe asking for space had been a mistake. I had wanted him to fight for us, to protest, to remind me that I mattered. Instead, my absence seemed to give him permission to step into a version of himself I no longer recognized. I wondered if he had needed freedom just as much as I had, but unlike me, he chose not to spend it in solitude. The thought pierced deeper than I could have imagined. Conversations between us grew thinner, stretched across gaps of silence that felt deliberate. When I tried to bring up the distance I sensed, he brushed it aside with practiced ease. "You wanted space," he reminded me, his tone steady, almost detached. It was true, and I had no argument against it, but the words stung as though he was building a wall out of my own request. It became harder to tell whether I was being paranoid or if I was witnessing the slow unraveling of everything we had built together. At night, lying in my separate bed, I wrestled with questions that had no answers. Was he pulling away because of me, or had he been gone long before I asked for time? Was his calm acceptance a mask hiding his own hurt, or was it simply indifference? I thought I wanted independence, but what I really wanted was proof that I was still his choice. Each unexplained absence, each vague excuse, made it harder to believe that was true. The irony did not escape me. I had pushed for distance to find clarity, but instead I was drowning in uncertainty. I wanted to savor solitude, but jealousy ate away at the peace I thought I'd find. I told myself I couldn't demand his loyalty while asking him to step aside, yet in the quiet of my thoughts I longed for reassurance he no longer offered. I wondered if this was the beginning of the end, if my search for space had opened a door neither of us knew how to close. It started with small things that could be explained away if I wanted to convince myself nothing was wrong. A slip of paper tucked into his wallet with a number I didn't recognize. A charge on our bank statement for a restaurant I knew we had never visited together. The glow on his face when he checked his phone late at night. I told myself to ignore it, that I had no right to pry since I was the one who asked for distance, but the weight of suspicion grew heavier every day. I could no longer shake the feeling that his quiet acceptance had been less about patience and more about finding comfort elsewhere. One afternoon, while sorting through laundry, I found a receipt stuffed in the pocket of his jeans. 2 meals, a bottle of wine, and a dessert at a place far outside our usual routine. The date and time aligned perfectly with one of his late nights at work. My chest tightened, and for a moment I stood frozen, staring at the slip of paper that felt more damning than any argument. A piece of evidence that confirmed what my instincts had been whispering for weeks. My hands shook as I folded it back into the pocket, torn between rage and devastation. The discovery ignited a storm inside me. Anger at him for betraying the bond we built, anger at myself for creating the gap he filled. I thought back to the night I asked for space, the look on his face that I misread as calm acceptance. Maybe it hadn't been calm at all. Maybe it had been quiet calculation, a door closing with finality. My mind replayed every moment we had shared recently, the perfume on his shirt, the faint smile at his phone, the sudden effort he put into his appearance. They no longer seemed like harmless changes. They were puzzle pieces snapping into place, revealing the picture I had tried so hard not to see. When I finally confronted him, my voice was steady, but my heart raced. I asked him where he had been that night, what the receipt meant, who he had shared a meal with. At first, he tried to deflect, to act confused, but when I pressed harder, the mask cracked. His silence said more than words ever could. Eventually, with a tired sigh, he admitted what I already knew, that he had been spending time with someone else, that in my absence he had found companionship he no longer felt with me. The air between us turned heavy, charged with betrayal and grief. I demanded to know if it was serious, if he loved her, if I had already been replaced. He shook his head, saying it wasn't about love, it was about feeling noticed, feeling wanted. The words cut deep because I realized he was confessing to the same emptiness I had felt, only he had chosen to fill it with someone outside our marriage. I wanted to scream, to unleash every ounce of fury building inside me, but instead I stood frozen, hollowed out by the confirmation of my worst fears. In that moment, blame tangled itself into a knot I couldn't unravel. Was it my fault for pushing him away? Was it his fault for stepping outside our vows instead of facing the truth with me? Both answers seemed true, and neither offered comfort. I had wanted clarity, but what I received was a wound I could not ignore. The man I had loved and trusted had crossed a line we could never return from, and no amount of justification could soften the betrayal. After the confrontation, the silence between us was unbearable. We sat in separate rooms, the house filled with a tension so thick it was hard to breathe. My mind replayed the early days of our marriage, the laughter, the promises, the sense of being chosen. To see it now reduced to secrets and lies felt like mourning a death. I thought about how easily he had confessed, how little fight he seemed to have left in him, and I wondered if this had been coming long before I noticed. I didn't cry right away. The tears came later, in waves that shook me until I could hardly stand. Each one carried the weight of betrayal, the humiliation of realizing I had been replaced, the bitterness of knowing my plea for space had created the very void another woman stepped into. I wanted to hate him, but a part of me still loved him, and that contradiction tore me apart. The discovery shattered any illusion that our marriage was simply strained. It was broken in a way that could not be easily repaired. Trust, once fractured, could not be pieced back together with apologies. The confrontation left us both exposed, his loneliness, my desperation, our shared failure to reach for each other before we drifted too far apart. I had asked for time alone, but what I received was proof that while I was searching for myself, he had already gone searching for someone else. In the days that followed, I moved through life in a haze, replaying the confrontation over and over until the words blurred together. He had admitted enough to confirm my fears, but not enough to give me closure. He insisted it wasn't about love, that it was about attention, about feeling alive again. I wanted to believe that meant there was still something left for us, but the image of him with someone else refused to leave my mind. It clung to me in quiet moments, poisoning every memory we had shared. I looked at him and saw a stranger I had once trusted with my entire heart. Nights alone became heavier than before. At first, solitude had felt like a choice, a chance to breathe, but now it felt like punishment. I lay awake questioning myself, asking if I had been naive to think stepping back would fix anything. The truth was harder to admit. I had been avoiding the real problem, hoping distance would magically create answers. Instead, it only created space for betrayal to grow. I wondered if I had set the stage for this, if my request for time alone had been the first crack in a wall that could not hold any longer. Anger mixed with grief until I couldn't tell one from the other. I was furious with him for betraying me, but I was equally furious with myself for not seeing it sooner. For months, maybe years, we had been pretending our marriage was stronger than it was, ignoring the signs that we were both starving for connection. He had chosen to fill that hunger elsewhere, while I had chosen silence. Neither choice could be undone. The question was no longer who was at fault, but whether we had anything worth saving. I tried to imagine reconciliation. I pictured us sitting across from each other, laying everything bare, promising to rebuild trust brick by brick. I wondered if counseling could help, if forgiveness was even possible. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized forgiveness wasn't something I could force. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the receipt, the perfume, the unreadable look on his face. How could I ever believe his words again when his actions had already betrayed them? The thought of spending the rest of my life questioning his loyalty felt like a slow death. At the same time, the idea of walking away terrified me. Our lives were intertwined in ways that couldn't be undone overnight. Years of shared history, a home, memories both beautiful and painful. To leave meant acknowledging that everything we built had collapsed, that the love I once trusted so completely had been destroyed. It meant starting over alone, carrying scars I never asked for. Yet staying meant living with the constant reminder of what had been lost. Neither path offered comfort. Both promised pain. Eventually, I realized the choice wasn't about him at all. It was about me. For too long, I had shaped my decisions around his needs, his moods, his indifference. Even when I asked for time alone, it was less about myself and more about hoping it would jolt him into noticing me again. But in the aftermath of betrayal, I could no longer ignore the truth. If I stayed, it couldn't be because I feared loneliness. If I left, it couldn't be because I wanted to punish him. Whatever choice I made had to come from valuing myself, something I had neglected for years. I spent long hours reflecting on the person I had become in this marriage. The woman who once dreamed boldly now second-guessed every thought. The woman who once laughed freely now carried silence like armor. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped fighting for my own happiness, hoping he would do it for me. That realization was painful, but it also gave me strength. His betrayal was devastating, but it forced me to confront the truth I had been avoiding. I couldn't keep shrinking myself in the hope of being loved the way I used to be. When I finally spoke to him again, I was calmer than I expected. I told him I wasn't ready to decide whether forgiveness was possible, but I knew things could never return to the way they were. If we tried again, it would require honesty, work, and a willingness to face the parts of ourselves we had been running from. If we parted, it would be because we had reached the end of what we could give each other. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable, but for once I didn't need his reaction to validate my words. The days after that conversation felt different. The grief was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. I began to see that my life didn't have to be defined by his choices or by the failure of our marriage. Whether we rebuilt or walked away, I had to reclaim the pieces of myself I had abandoned. I started making small promises to myself, to nurture friendships I had neglected, to pursue passions I had set aside, to remember that I was more than just someone's wife. The story of us was scarred, maybe even broken beyond repair, but my story was not over. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope that my life could be more than betrayal and regret. Maybe I would choose to walk away, maybe I would attempt to rebuild, but either way I knew one truth with certainty. I deserved a love that didn't leave me questioning my worth. And whether that love came from him, from someone else, or simply from within myself, I would no longer settle for less.